Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Morning arrived without ceremony, the kind that came pale and cold, lights spreading slowly across the settlement as if unsure it was welcome there. The buildings along the main street stood stiff and uneven, wood-warped by years of weather and neglect, their fronts painted once and never again. Smoke rose thin from a few chimneys, carrying the smell of burned coffee and stale bread. The town was awake, but not alert. It rarely was. At the far edge of the street, where the packed dirt gave way to scrub and open ground, a cottonwood tree stood alone, its trunk thick and scarred from old nails and careless use. Two women were tied to it. Their wrists were bound separately around the trunk, rope pulled tight enough to keep them in place, but not tight enough to draw blood yet. The fibers were rough, reused, stiff from dust and sweat. Their backs pressed into the bark, shoulders squared, boots planted firmly in the dirt. They stood close, but did not lean into one another, each holding her own balance, each conserving strength. They were young, but not untouched by hardship. Their faces carried exhaustion more than fear, the kind that came from long nights without rest and longer years without protection. Their clothing was simple and worn, practical rather than decorative, stained at the hems with dirt and travel. One wore her dark hair braided tight against her head, every strand controlled. The other had left hers looser, tied back enough to keep it from her face. They were identical in shape and features, but the way they held themselves marked the difference. People passed. A baker stepped outside, wiped his hands on his apron, glanced at them once, then turned back inside without comment. A woman carrying a basket slowed, hesitated, then adjusted her grip and walked on. A pair of men lingered just long enough to look, long enough to confirm that the punishment was still happening, then moved on. No one spoke to the women. No one asked what they had taken or why. The silence was deliberate. This was meant to be seen, not questioned. The woman with the braid kept her head up. Her gaze was steady, scanning the street without expectation, jaw set, breathing controlled. She did not look for help. She did not look away either. The other kept her eyes lowered, not in shame, but calculation, conserving energy, protecting herself from the strain of watching faces that would not change. Fear was there, quiet and contained, sitting deep in their chests where panic could not reach it easily. They had learned long ago what panic cost. They focused instead on staying upright, on keeping circulation in their hands, on waiting for the sun to climb high enough to bring warmth. Elias Cole rode into town just after the sun cleared the low buildings. He had planned his arrival carefully, as he always did, timing it to avoid crowds and unnecessary conversation. He tied his horse at the far end of the street, away from the noise, checking the knot twice before turning away. He moved with purpose but not urgency, his posture relaxed, his eyes forward. Towns made him uneasy, not because of danger, but because of memory. Too many places like this had taught him what happened when no one stepped forward. He walked toward the supply store, his list already arranged in his head: flour, nails, salt, nothing more. He did not intend to stay long. He noticed the women because the space around them felt wrong. There was movement everywhere else, boots scraping, voices rising and falling, doors opening and closing. But near the cottonwood, everything slowed. Elias felt it before he saw it. A tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with threat and everything to do with recognition. He stopped walking. He did not move closer right away. He stood where he was and observed, letting his eyes take in the details without drawing attention. The ropes, the lack of guards, the way no one stood near them, as if punishment were contagious. He understood enough without needing explanation. His first reaction was caution. This was not his town. Intervening meant being seen. Being seen led to questions, and questions had a way of pulling at parts of his past he had worked hard to keep buried. He felt the familiar pressure behind his ribs, the instinct to keep distance, to finish his business and leave. Then the woman with the braid looked directly at him. Her eyes met his without challenge or appeal. There was no request there, no expectation, just awareness. She had noticed him noticing. Elias felt it land heavier than any plea could have. He looked at the other sister, saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers curled slightly against the rope as if testing it without wasting strength. Empathy came without warning, sharp and unwelcome. Not pity, recognition. He thought of other mornings, other places where people had stood and watched because it was easier than choosing a side. He remembered what it felt like to arrive too late once, to understand what needed to be done only after it no longer mattered. The decision did not feel brave. It felt unavoidable. Elias stepped forward, his pace steady, his expression unreadable. A few heads turned, curiosity flickering briefly before settling back into indifference. He reached the tree, pulled his knife from his belt, and cut the first rope cleanly. The fibers snapped apart with a dull sound. He moved to the second wrist and did the same, careful not to graze skin. Neither woman spoke. Neither thanked him. They flexed their hands slowly, blood returning. Eyes alert, bodies ready in case this was not finished. Elias walked to the bakery, placed coins on the counter without argument, and took a loaf of bread. He set it down near the barrel by the tree. "You can walk," he said quietly, his voice low and even. He did not wait for a response. He turned away, already preparing himself for the consequences of having been seen, already deciding that if this brought trouble, he would handle it the same way he handled everything else, directly, without noise. As he walked back toward his horse, he told himself not to look back. He told himself they would go their own way. He told himself this was the end of it. Behind him, the sound of footsteps followed. The sound of footsteps stayed behind Elias longer than he expected, steady and unhurried, neither rushing to catch up nor falling away. He did not turn at first. He adjusted his grip on the reins, checked the cinch by habit, and mounted with the same controlled movements he used every day, giving himself a moment to decide whether to acknowledge what he already knew. When he finally looked back, the two women stood several paces behind him in the road, not close enough to crowd him, not far enough to pretend this was coincidence. They waited without signaling, hands free now but still held carefully, circulation returning slowly. The one with the braid met his eyes again, calm, alert, reading his posture the way people learn to read weather. The other stayed slightly to the side, her attention moving between him, the buildings, and the open land beyond. Elias felt the weight of choice settle in his chest. He had told them they could walk. He had not told them where. He nodded once, not an invitation, but acknowledgement, and turned his horse toward the open ground east of town. If they followed, it would be because they chose to. That distinction mattered more to him than he cared to admit. They walked behind him as he rode out, keeping a distance that felt deliberate. He slowed his pace without making a show of it, giving them time to adjust, aware of the strain the ropes had left in their shoulders and wrists. He did not speak. He listened instead to the rhythm of their steps, to the way they stopped when he stopped, to the silence that did not press or demand explanation. The town fell away quickly. The sound softened. Wood and stone gave way to grass and wind. Elias felt his breathing ease as the buildings disappeared behind them, the familiar relief of distance returning. He had not realized how tense he had been until it loosened. They reached a shallow rise where the road split into nothing more than ruts. Elias dismounted, led his horse to a patch of shade, and set down his pack. He took out his canteen and held it out without comment. The braided woman accepted it first, drank sparingly, then passed it to her sister. Neither thanked him. He did not expect it. As they rested, Elias watched them the way he watched land, looking for signs of trouble rather than weakness. He noticed how the braided woman rolled her shoulders slowly, working feeling back in her arms, how the other stayed seated, conserving energy, eyes always moving. These were not people accustomed to being carried. That eased something in him. When they resumed, the walk stretched long and quiet. Elias rode ahead, giving them space, his thoughts occupied by practical concerns he used to keep emotion at bay. Food would last longer than expected. The house could be rearranged. The bunk room was unused. He told himself he was thinking ahead, not committing. Still, unease stayed with him, not fear of them, but fear of what staying might require. He had built his life to function without anyone depending on him. Dependence had once led to hesitation, and hesitation had led to loss. He felt that memory press against his ribs, sharp and unwelcome, but he did not let it slow him. As the ranch finally came into view, low against the open land, Elias felt a shift he could not fully explain. He dismounted near the fence and waited. When the sisters reached him, he gestured toward the well, the house, the space available. "You can rest here," he said. Nothing more. He did not say how long. He did not say why. They stepped through the gate without hesitation, not with relief, but with caution shaped by experience. As Elias led his horse toward the corral, he told himself again that this was temporary. The land did not answer him. The first night passed without ceremony, the kind that settled in slowly once the light faded and the temperature dropped, leaving the ranch quiet in a way that felt different now. Not crowded, not loud, just occupied. Elias lit the lamp and set it on the table, its glow catching on the worn edges of the room, the long-unused second bed, the shelf that held only what he needed to get through each day. He was aware of every sound, the soft shift of boots on wood, the controlled movements of people careful not to overstep, but none of it carried threat. He showed them where to sleep with a brief gesture, then returned to the main room without waiting for a response. He prepared food the way he always did, methodical and efficient, adding water to stretch what little he had without comment. When they joined him at the table, they sat where space was offered, not crowding him, not withdrawing either. They ate in silence. The only sounds the scrape of utensils and the steady breathing of people who had learned to stay alert even while resting. Elias felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly as the minutes passed without incident. He watched them out of the corner of his eye, noting details he could not stop himself from tracking. The way Mara kept her posture upright, even while tired, the way Lila paused between bites, gauging how much was safe to take. These were not habits formed overnight. He recognized them too well. After the meal, Mara stood and gathered the plates without asking. Elias opened his mouth to stop her, then closed it again. He let her work. It felt important that she be allowed to choose usefulness rather than wait for permission. Lila wiped the table carefully, movements precise, eyes down but aware. The room adjusted itself around them, not through conversation, but through shared understanding. Sleep came unevenly for Elias. He lay on his bed listening, not for danger, but for change, the kind that came when something settled into place without asking. He heard the soft rustle of blankets, the controlled exhale of breath, the quiet sounds of people resting without fully letting go. His mind returned, uninvited, to past nights when he had promised himself to remain alert and failed. The memory tightened his chest, but he stayed awake long enough this time to be sure nothing needed him. Morning arrived clear and cold. Elias was already up and the sisters stepped into the main room, the stove warming slowly, the smell of coffee filling the space. He set out tasks without framing them as expectations. A broken fence rail, water barrels that needed hauling, a loose hinge on the barn door. He spoke plainly, leaving room for refusal. Neither refused. They worked with care rather than speed, learning the land as it was rather than forcing it to change. Mara took on the heavier labor, lifting and bracing with steady strength, matching Elias's pace without competition. Lila stayed near the house at first, cleaning, organizing, then moving outward as confidence grew, her awareness sharp, her presence quiet but constant. Elias found himself adjusting without thinking, placing tools where they could reach them, slowing his movements to keep the work shared rather than separate. He noticed a shift only when he realized he was no longer working around people, but with them. The thought unsettled him more than he expected. By late afternoon, the ranch looked no different to an outsider, but Elias felt the change in the way the space held sound, in the way footsteps no longer echoed as sharply. When he looked up from the fence and saw the sisters working within his line of sight, not watching him, not waiting, simply doing what needed doing, he felt something unfamiliar settle in. Not comfort, not yet, but the absence of resistance. As the sun dipped and the day drew to a close, Elias stood still for a moment longer than necessary, hands resting on the fence rail, aware that whatever this was, it was already moving beyond temporary, whether he was ready to name it or not. By the fourth morning, the ranch no longer felt like a place holding its breath. Elias noticed it while pulling on his boots, the quiet different from before, no longer sharp or hollow, but layered, marked by movement that did not require his attention. The stove had already been lit. Coffee simmered low, watched carefully. He paused in the doorway longer than usual, listening, adjusting to the fact that the day had begun without him, setting it in motion. Outside, the air was cold enough to stiffen fingers. Elias moved through his routine as he always did, checking the animals, walking the fence line, testing posts that had held for years and those that had not. He worked alone at first, not because he expected to be left that way, but because habit still guided him more than trust. Mara joined him without announcement. She picked up the extra hammer where he had set it out deliberately, but without invitation. Her movements controlled, efficient, her presence neither intrusive nor hesitant. She did not ask what needed doing. She watched, adjusted, and began bracing the post opposite him, hands firm, stand solid. Elias felt a brief impulse to correct her position, then stopped himself when he saw she had already chosen the right angle. They worked in parallel silence, the rhythm steady, nails driven clean, the fence set straight. He was aware of her in a way he did not allow himself to be aware of most people. Not distracted, but attentive, noting how she waited when he paused, how she did not rush to fill gaps or prove usefulness. That restraint mattered to him more than strength. Lila remained near the house, but her presence carried outward. Elias saw her through the open door, sorting tools, wiping surfaces he had long accepted as permanently dusty, moving through the space as if she understood where quiet belonged. She did not linger in the doorway or watch them work. She did not hover. She found tasks and completed them, then moved on. At midday, Elias brought water out without comment. They drank in turns, standing apart, but connected by the simple fact of shared labor. He noticed the faint marks on their wrists where the rope had been, the skin still tender, and felt a brief tightening in his chest that he pushed aside. Sympathy could become distraction if left unattended. The afternoon brought more work than expected. A hinge on the barn door failed, with splitting along the grain. Elias knelt to assess it, already deciding how much time it would cost. Mara crouched beside him, studying the break with the same focus, her brow furrowed slightly, not from confusion, but calculation. "It can hold," she said quietly, her voice low and used but steady. "If you reset it." He glanced at her, surprised not by the suggestion, but by how closely it matched his own assessment. He nodded once and handed her the tool. She took it without hesitation. The adjustment took longer than planned, but it was done right. When they stepped back, the door swung cleanly, no drag, no sound. Elias felt the satisfaction settle deeper than the work itself justified. He told himself it was about efficiency. He did not question why it felt different. As evening approached, the three of them moved through the space without needing direction. Lila prepared food while Elias washed up, Mara stacking wood without being asked. No one claimed roles. No one assigned them. The balance formed because it was practical. That night, as Elias sat at the table, he realized he had not once wondered whether the sisters would leave. The thought had passed its point of relevance without announcement. He felt the weight of that realization settle slowly, not heavy, but present. When he lay down to sleep, the memories that usually pressed at him stayed distant. Not gone, but held back by the steady sounds of people who were no longer passing through. For the first time in years, Elias did not listen for departure. The days settled into a pattern that no one announced and no one questioned, shaped by work and weather rather than intention. Elias marked time the way he always had, by the position of the sun and the condition of the land, but he began to notice that his attention no longer stayed fixed on tasks alone. There were now other movements to account for, other rhythms that did not disrupt his own, but ran alongside it. Mara worked with him more often than not. It was not planned. She simply appeared where the labor was heavier, where steadiness mattered more than speed. She lifted without strain, braced without instruction, and waited when he paused, never pushing ahead, never lagging behind. Elias found that he trusted her positioning without checking it twice, a small shift that unsettled him when he noticed it happening. They spoke rarely, and when they did, it was brief and precise. A word about a loose rail, a quiet warning about uneven ground. Once, when the wind picked up and dust cut across the yard, Elias watched her pull her scarf higher without breaking stride, eyes forward, posture unchanged. The sight stirred something tight and familiar in his chest. Not concern exactly, but recognition of someone who had learned not to waste motion. Lila remained no less present, though her work took a different shape. She learned the house the way some people learn terrain, testing drawers, adjusting shelves, repairing what had been ignored not out of laziness but necessity. Elias noticed tools returning to places he did not remember assigning, meals stretching further without comment, the quiet efficiency of someone who knew how to survive without being seen. One afternoon, Elias caught himself setting out an extra plate before realizing what he was doing. He paused, hands still, then finished the task without correcting himself. The action felt natural enough that it did not alarm him until later, when he understood that he had not thought of it as temporary. The memory of his past stayed with him, but it no longer pressed at him the same way. There were moments, brief and unwelcome, when old images surfaced, faces he had lost, decisions delayed too long. In those moments, he found himself grounding in the present without effort, in the sound of work being done nearby, in the certainty that if he looked up, someone would be there, not waiting, not demanding, simply present. That realization carried weight. Dependence had once cost him everything. He had built his life to avoid it. Yet this was different. No one leaned on him. No one asked him to fill what they lacked. They stood on their own ground, and somehow that made space for him to do the same. As the sun lowered at the end of the day, Elias and Mara stood near the corral, watching the animals settle. The light cut low across the land, catching dust and fence wire, flattening shadows. Neither spoke. There was no need. The silence between them held no tension, only the shared understanding of work finished and work waiting. Lila joined them a few steps back, hands folded loosely, gaze calm. Elias felt the weight of the moment, not as pressure, but as confirmation. This was no longer a question of how long they would stay. It was a matter of how deeply they already had. The riders arrived just before midday, when the work rhythm had settled and the heat began to press down enough to slow, careless movement. Elias noticed them first from the change in sound rather than sight. The faint rhythm of hooves carried unevenly by the wind, out of place against the steady noises of the ranch. He straightened slowly from the fence rail he was setting, wiped his hands on his trousers, and looked toward the open land. Two men approached at a measured pace, not rushing, not cautious enough to suggest fear. They rode with the confidence of people accustomed to being obeyed, hats low, coats open, eyes already moving over what did not belong to them. Elias felt the familiar tightening settle behind his ribs, not panic but readiness, the kind shaped by years of choosing restraint over reaction. Mara noticed the riders a moment later. She did not speak. She shifted her stance slightly, setting her weight more evenly, gaze fixed forward. Lila stepped back toward the house without being told, not retreating, simply positioning herself where she could see and hear without being exposed. Elias registered these movements with quiet approval. No one scattered. No one froze. He walked toward the house and stopped in the doorway, placing himself there without thought or announcement. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was simply where he belonged when strangers crossed his land. He rested one hand against the doorframe, posture relaxed, shoulders squared, eyes steady. The riders dismounted inside the fence without asking. They spoke first, asking questions framed as courtesy but edged with expectation. They mentioned town concerns. They implied unfinished business. Elias listened without interrupting, letting the words settle, measuring tone rather than content. When he answered, his voice was low and even, each sentence brief, clear, and final. He said no one on his land was leaving. He said there would be no discussion. He said the matter was closed. The men exchanged a glance, irritation passing quickly between them. One of them shifted his weight and looked past Elias, his eyes catching on Mara for the first time. She met his gaze directly, expression unreadable, posture unyielding. She did not step forward. She did not step back. The moment stretched just long enough for Elias to adjust his stance by a fraction, blocking the line of sight without making a show of it. That small movement settled something. Lila remained visible in the doorway behind him. Not hidden, not guarded, simply present. The riders took this in, reassessed, and Elias saw the calculation shift. This was not a place of fear. It was a place of decision. After a moment that felt longer than it was, one of the men nodded, sharp and displeased, and turned away. They mounted without further words and rode back the way they had come, dust trailing behind them until the land swallowed it again. Elias did not move until the sound was gone. When he finally stepped away from the doorway, the ranch felt unchanged, yet settled in a way it had not before. Mara exhaled slowly, tension easing from her shoulders. Lila returned to her work without comment. Elias stood still for a moment longer, aware that the boundary he had drawn was not temporary, not reactive, but chosen. He had not defended an arrangement. He had defended a household. And for the first time since the riders had arrived, he felt no need to brace for what came next. The air shifted in the weeks that followed, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty that comes with routine settling into place. The ranch felt fuller, but not crowded. The work did not change, but it grew smoother, quieter, as if the land itself had begun to understand its new shape. Elias had never been one for grand gestures or flashy claims, and the rhythm they found together was no different. It was built in the small, deliberate moments, the extra hand on a stubborn gate, the quiet recognition of effort when it wasn't asked for, the unspoken understanding that each one of them held a place here. Elias found himself adjusting, not out of necessity, but out of something he couldn't quite name. He had learned, over time, to keep distance, to avoid attachment, to guard himself from those who could take too much. But with Mara and Lila, he never felt the need to protect anything. They worked beside him, and without words, they made the space safer, more secure. One evening, when the last light had dipped below the horizon and the sky stretched thin and bruised with the dying colors of the day, Elias sat on the porch, not watching the land, but feeling it. He had not intended to stay out so long, but the work had left him with nothing but silence, and silence had its own weight. Mara came up quietly behind him, her footsteps muffled on the porch, as if she, too, had learned how to move without announcing her presence. She did not sit, but stood beside him, a few steps away, leaning slightly against the railing. Her hands were steady at her sides, not clenched, just present. The air between them hung still, not awkward, but full of unspoken things. A shared exhaustion, a mutual respect. The land between them was quiet, nothing demanding, just the steady hum of evening. "Mara," Elias said, breaking the silence softly, his voice more gravel than usual. "How long were you planning to stay?" The question was more of a thought, something that had been lingering at the edge of his mind for days now. He hadn't meant to ask, but there it was, rolling out without warning. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she let the moment breathe. Then, after a pause, she spoke in her low, calm voice, as though she were considering the question as much as answering it. "As long as you don't make us leave." Elias took in her words without flinching. They were simple, direct, but they carried a weight that made the air between them thicken just slightly. His chest tightened, not from her words, but from the realization that, for the first time in a long time, he hadn't felt the need to tell anyone to go. He hadn't felt the need to keep them at arm's length. "I didn't think you would," he said, his tone quiet but steady. She gave him a slight nod, but didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The understanding was there between them, shared not in words but in actions, in staying. And as the evening stretched on, neither of them moved, letting the night swallow the light and the silence deepen. Lila came out a short while later, her figure half hidden in the shadow of the house. She stepped onto the porch, glancing first at Elias, then at Mara. She didn't say anything, but there was an unspoken exchange in the way she looked at each of them, as if checking that they were both present, that they were both still here. She moved to the railing beside Mara, and Elias noticed her posture relaxed, her shoulders easing into the quiet that wrapped around the land. They stood there together, the three of them, a small unit in the gathering darkness. The night was still, but it was filled with everything unsaid. The work they'd done, the hours they'd spent beside each other, the trust they had slowly built without naming it. Elias stayed on the porch a while longer, the weight of his decision pressing into the space between them, but in a way that no longer felt burdened. This was not something that could be undone. This was no longer about what he had lost in the past. This was about what they had built together, quietly, with no promises, no demands, just the act of staying. The land held them. And for the first time in years, Elias let himself believe it could hold him, too. The decision did not arrive as a declaration. It surfaced the way most things had between them, quietly, through repetition and shared space that no longer felt provisional. Elias became aware of it one morning while repairing a section of roof before the heat rose, when Mara climbed up beside him without being asked and handed him the nails he needed before he reached for them. The movement was practiced, familiar, not intimate in gesture, but close in understanding. He paused only long enough to realize that this was not something that would end on its own. They worked until midday, then sat on the edge of the porch steps to eat, dust on their clothes, hands steady, back straight. Lila moved in and out of the house, preparing supplies for the afternoon, her presence easy, unguarded. The ranch functioned now as a single system, each of them anticipating the others without effort. That afternoon, Elias rode into town alone for the first time since the riders had come. He did not announce it. He simply went. The town looked smaller than he remembered, its edges worn thin, its authority brittle. He spoke little, bought what he needed, and stopped once at the edge of the street near the cottonwood tree. The space stood empty now, unmarked, as if nothing had ever happened there. He did not linger. When he returned, Mara was mending tack at the table, her hands moving with care, Lila nearby, sorting grain. Elias set his purchases down and remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, feeling the weight of words he did not often use press against him. He understood that if he did not speak now, nothing would be lost, but something would remain unfinished. He waited until evening, until the work was done and the light softened enough to slow the day. They stood outside together near the fence, the land quiet, animals settled. Elias cleared his throat once, not from uncertainty, but from habit. "I don't intend for this to change," he said, his voice even, eyes forward. "I intend for it to stay." Mara did not answer immediately. She turned toward him fully, studying his face, not searching for weakness, but certainty. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "Then say it clearly." He nodded once, accepting the truth of that. "I want you here," he said, "as my wife." There was no ceremony in the words, no flourish, only intention. The air did not shift. The land did not respond. Mara simply held his gaze, measuring not the promise, but the man making it. After a moment, she inclined her head. "I already am," she said quietly. Lila watched from a few steps away, her expression calm, resolute. When Elias looked toward her, she met his eyes without hesitation. "This is my home," she said. "I choose it." That night, they ate together as they always had, the table no different, the room unchanged. Yet Elias felt the final line settle into place, not as relief, but as alignment. There was nothing left to decide. The ranch held them as it always had. The difference now was that they had named why they would not leave. The wedding took place at the ranch on a clear morning that did not ask for attention. There was no crowd, no music, no attempt to make the moment larger than it needed to be. Elias and Mara stood near the fence line where the ground was level and the work of the land was always visible, dressed in clean clothes chosen for comfort rather than display. Lila stood beside them as witness, steady and composed, her presence as certain as the soil beneath their boots. The words were spoken simply and without hesitation. Elias spoke with the same calm he used when setting boundaries and keeping promises, his voice firm, his posture relaxed. Mara answered him without pause, her gaze level, her expression clear. There was no doubt in either of them. What they named had already been lived. Afterward, the day continued. Work was done because work needed doing. A meal was shared because the body required it. The ranch did not pause to acknowledge the change, but Elias felt it in the smallest details. The way Mara moved through the house without asking. The way Lila planned weeks ahead as if there were no alternative future. Nothing felt claimed. Everything felt chosen. Seasons passed, marked by repairs finished before storms arrived and harvests brought in without urgency. Elias grew older into the life rather than out of it, his silence no longer shaped by withdrawal, but by peace. Mara stood beside him through each day, capable and unwavering, her presence never demanding, never uncertain. Lila remained part of the household by her own decision, building a life that required no permission. The town faded into the distance, its judgments and habits losing relevance. The cottonwood tree became nothing more than a landmark passed on rare supply runs, stripped of meaning by time and distance. What mattered stayed here. On an evening much like any other, Elias stood at the edge of the yard watching the land settle into night, the sound of voices behind him low and familiar. He did not feel watched. He did not feel alone. The ranch was no longer a place he endured or defended. It was home, and it stayed that way. The day began the way most days did now, without urgency and without silence pressing down on the walls. Light entered the house through the east window, thin at first, then steady, warming the table and the floorboards Elias had repaired years ago. The stove was already lit when he stepped into the main room, coffee heating slowly, the smell familiar and grounding. Mara was outside before him, sleeves rolled, checking the animals with the calm assurance of someone who had done it 100 times and expected to do it 100 more. She moved with ease, not watched, not guarding herself, simply living within the space she had helped shape. When she saw Elias, she nodded once, a small gesture that carried more meaning than words ever had between them. Lila worked near the house, sorting grain and making notes on a scrap of paper about supplies that would last through the next month. She no longer kept to the edges. Her place was clear, her routines steady, her presence unquestioned. She hummed quietly as she worked, not for anyone's benefit, just because the day allowed it. They shared breakfast at the table, plates set without thought, conversation minimal and unnecessary. Elias listened to the sounds of the ranch waking, the wind through the grass, the creak of leather, the quiet confidence of lives moving in parallel. Nothing felt fragile. Nothing felt temporary. The morning passed with ordinary work. A fence was checked. Tools were cleaned and put away. Mara and Elias repaired a section of roof together, working close without crowding, hands passing what was needed before it was asked for. Lila brought water when the sun climbed higher, then returned to her tasks without ceremony. By afternoon, the heat softened into something manageable. They rested briefly in the shade, sharing space without filling it, then returned to what remained undone. There was no rush. The land did not demand it. As evening approached, they gathered near the porch, the sky stretching wide and clear. A simple meal was prepared and eaten slowly. Elias watched the light fade and felt no need to measure time. The day had been full enough. When night settled, they moved inside together, the house holding warmth and quiet. Elias realized, without surprise, that this was what he had been building toward all along, not an escape from the past, but a life that did not revolve around it. There were no plans made aloud, no promises repeated. They had already stayed, and tomorrow would look much the same, which was exactly what made it good.